Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we look at the Westminster autumn session of Parliament under the shadow of the long COVID pandemic. This week, almost a year after a general election where he swept back to power with a majority of 80, Boris Johnson finally lost his opinion poll lead over the opposition Labour Party. And the trouble is not confined to the opinion polls, with restless Tory MPs threatening another revolt over the way in which renewed COVID regulations are being introduced. All this with the economy facing the double cliff edge of another lockdown and the interminable lorry crash of European withdrawal. Today we ask political commentators Peter Oborne and Professor Richard Murphy what exactly is going on the left and the right of British politics as the Westminster Parliament struggles to hold the government to account during the pandemic and the Brexit denouement finally arrives. But first, over to Alex with your reaction to last week's show with your tweets, messages and emails.
There was a big reaction to last week's show, which featured our three top experts on COVID-19 and a huge audience on Facebook as well. Now, first up was Primavera, an old friend of the show, an anti-HS2 campaigner, and she picked up the fact that our three medical experts all mentioned sustainability and climate change and population as a major factor in these emerging viruses. And then we had a number of people who were reflecting perhaps the growing public scepticism about some of the official messages on COVID. Elaine Somerville, for example, said, "I was really hoping that Alex Salmond would be questioning the narrative being peddled out daily by the government and the mainstream media and perhaps interview the many doctors and scientists who are speaking to a different story." And Wilma says, "My question is, why is the UK government saying the National Health Service is coping, yet hospital and doctor services are all restricted? So hospitals are there not coping." And Mary Doll, and that's a reference, I suspect, to the famous Elaine C. Smith character. Mary Doll says, "There's never been a safe vaccine, and something not tested is dangerous when you don't know what the side effects are." And Elliot says, "Hi Alec, can you ask them why the survival rates aren't being broadly advertised? Averaging 99.6% survival rate. Would be good to know your thoughts." And Jay Clark said, "Can you ask if this COVID flu will kill more people than traditional influenza over the next decade? And is the public hysteria justified with the government's actions?" But then, of course, other people say, as Charmaine does, there were great questions, informative answers. And Leslie Ann says, "Having lost an auntie to COVID-19, it breaks my heart to see people refusing to believe it's real." And that, of course, in a week where the world death toll topped 1 million people. And lastly, Sylvia Taylor says, "Bra show this week." I take it Sylvia's from Scotland. "Really insightful with clear explanations of COVID-19, the ongoing situation, and how hard-working experts are putting their time and great effort into finding out all they can about the virus and how to protect the general population from its very damaging effects." And now back to Tasmina.
Few commentators have analysed the manoeuvres on the left and right of British politics with more authority than Professor Richard Murphy and Peter Oborne. They now discuss with Alex where stands the autumn Westminster Parliament with the economy heading towards the twin cliff edges of COVID and Brexit.
Now, joining me to talk about the problems on the right and the left of British politics in this autumn session of Parliament, I've got Peter Oborne and Professor Richard Murphy. Welcome, guys, to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you very much. Hi. Pleasure to be on.
Peter, can I turn to you first? The government's got a majority of 80, less than a year since Boris triumphantly rode to victory in the general election. But now, this autumn, they're in trouble both on coronavirus and indeed on Brexit again. How can that possibly be?
It is amazing, given the strength of the Prime Minister's position as recently as last December, when he won this 80 majority, the biggest majority which the Conservatives have had since Maggie Thatcher was leader. Then suddenly there are these revolts on the Tory benches, there's growing government unpopularity. Over the weekend, we had this major moment when Keir Starmer went ahead of Boris Johnson in the polls. And what I would say is, for Conservative leaders, Conservative prime ministers, history shows that again and again, a big, apparently secure majority is not secure. The fact is that the Conservative Party is completely ruthless. If it decides that Johnson has to go, Johnson will go. You won't see him for dust.
Professor Richard Murphy, this is a remarkable thought. If you were the Conservative leader, if you were Prime Minister Boris Johnson, would you be more worried about the revolt in coronavirus led by Mr Brady, or would you be more worried about the European issues still unresolved in terms of the UK single market bill? Which one of these subjects would be the most worrying for you?
Oh, I don't think I've any doubt about that. It would be the internal market bill. The coronavirus one is problematic, but because the government has proved itself so able to U-turn so frequently on coronavirus that frankly none of us know where they are, I think they will do that again and again and keep people satisfied. The internal market bill is much more fundamental. For many Tories, this is almost existential. The rule of law is fundamental to being a Tory. So many Conservative MPs are lawyers. We know that the Bar Council is now raising questions about whether our Attorney General can in fact be chair of the Bar, which by tradition, the Attorney General always is. There are literally proceedings against Tory MPs for professional misconduct for voting for this bill. It is challenging, therefore, what it is to be a Conservative. And actually, this comes back almost to literally the question of being a Tory and the difference between being a Tory and a Conservative. And literally, this is Irish history, a little bit of which I know. Tory is an Irish word. It means the brigand, the pursued. And this is really what Johnson is turning the Tory party into over the issue of the internal market bill. And I believe that that is a fundamental conflict with what the Conservative element of the Conservative Party is wanting to do. And it's that conflict within the Tories themselves that is now becoming apparent for all to see, and which is straining the party itself to its limits. And I believe that's why it's the real threat to Johnson.
Peter Oborne, few people know more about Tories and Toryism than you do. Is that a fair analysis from Richard Murphy?
Richard Murphy is 100% correct on his analysis that conservatism has at the root of it deep embedded respect for the rule of law. But I think he's politically wrong. Politically, what's going to hurt the Tories most of all, hurt Johnson, potentially get rid of Boris Johnson, if he's seen to have grossly mishandled coronavirus for the second time. Remember, we know that he mishandled. He missed the first 5 Cobra meetings when it was starting in the late winter. Now, if it goes wrong again, voters, all of them, have suffered from coronavirus, directly or indirectly. It's deeply impacted their lives. If Mr. Johnson is seen as being incompetent to handle this, it will hit him viscerally in the polls. It will count for more than what I completely agree about, the point about Conservative Party being about the rule of law.
But what is it that's behind the Graham Brady type revolt? I mean, is there a big section of the Parliamentary Conservative Party who really want to see the virus let rip, to take it on the chin, as the Prime Minister once said? Is it that, or is it just holding up the rights of Parliament against an overmighty government who want to legislate without their approval?
I think that there is. Imagine if Mr. Johnson was still a columnist on the Daily Telegraph and he would be wanging off columns about about the state and the power of the state and the liberty of the individual and the absurdity of the government position. In government, of course, Mr. Johnson has to take into account all kinds of other considerations. So I think actually it's a part of Johnson's own personality manifesting itself as on the Brexiteering wing of the Conservative backbenches. And I think this is going to be a really major issue from now on in.
Richard Murphy, the Labour Party, I mean, have they really got a different policy on COVID-19 from the government, or are they just kind of nitpicking where things go wrong?
Who knows? I mean, genuinely, who does really know at the moment? Labour is playing a very, very safe game indeed. And I know that there are plenty of people who are frustrated by that. So long as Labour thinks that it's showing up Johnson every week at the dispatch box and steer Keir Starmer is undoubtedly doing that. I mean, I don't think Boris Johnson has won one of their exchanges. Then he's keeping his parliamentary party happy. He knows he is alienating the left, and he's living with that. With regard to the economy and coronavirus, all he needs to do is say you should have done track and trace better, and there isn't a person in the UK who I suspect disagrees with them, and that they should have a better policy on furlough and job replacement schemes, and I again doubt that there are many people who disagree with them, and they've scored the necessary points that they want. Do they have a policy? Well, their defence is we're not in government. It's not our job at the moment to have an alternative policy. I doubt that. I think they should have a policy, but that's what Labour's doing. It's playing it incredibly safe with a new leader who's simply not trying to take risks. So it's a difficult position for Labour to be in, but they're playing that card.
And on Europe, Richard Murphy, I mean, isn't Sir Keir Starmer the person who told Jeremy Corbyn that he should be far more pro-European and take a more assertive pro-European line? Now he's leader. He, and indeed the Liberal Democrats, seem to have deserted the field on Europe just while 5 former Prime Ministers are queuing up to denounce the government's policy.
I'm staggered that, in fact, in June, he did not take some initiatives, particularly with regard to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and point out that, frankly, it could not be delivered in the way that was then going to happen. He could have stood up and said, unless there are guarantees, we're going to oppose this position on 30th June, which was the last date when it could really be effectively opposed. And he didn't do anything. And I think that was a mistake on his part, because there was a line in the sand to be drawn then to say there is a reason for opposition on this issue at this time, because there are better things to do. He hasn't shown himself to be a leader on that issue, and I'm disappointed by that. I do think he's walked away. He's simply playing to the red wall vote at the moment, and you can say politically that might be a wise thing to do, but it doesn't position him well for a future policy position.
Can you explain that, Peter Oborne, why the opposition parties, the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, have fled the field on Brexit just when the government's hitting a wall?
It's pure politics. Again, I find myself agreeing with Richard Murphy entirely about the missed opportunity, particularly on Northern Ireland, but also on every other issue. But here, it is obvious that Keir Starmer is playing a 5-year game. He thinks that I've got 4 years to let the government make a greater and greater mess of things. He's going from the, isn't it Napoleon who said, never interrupt the enemy when he is making a mistake. It's incredibly cautious. He's portraying, as Richard Murphy says, a lot of things he believes in, but he is a man with his eyes set firmly on Downing Street.
Peter, do you think these socially distanced conferences are going to catch on after Keir Starmer's speech, which seemed to be out in a balcony at the Labour Party headquarters, as far as I could make out? Are these going to catch on, or are we going to get back to the old style when times are more normal?
When all the MPs are there and they go to the bars, you will remember how intimidating the whips are. They use the muscle of the party to often physically, but certainly mentally intimidate and torture rebels. With so many MPs back in their constituencies, that they're less easy to intimidate. And the second thing is that Keir Starmer is a very good interrogator in the Commons. He's greatly helped by the fact he hasn't got 350 Tories on the benches baying at him. It's more like a courtroom for him now, which is a very familiar atmosphere for Sir Keir Starmer QC.
Now, join us after the break, where our two experts will turn to Sir Keir Starmer's prospects as leader of the Labour Party. Could he really be the next Prime Minister? And we'll look in detail at the challenges from Scotland and Ireland to the Johnson government. Join us then.
Welcome back. Alex is in conversation with top commentators Peter Oborne and Professor Richard Murphy about the autumn session of the Westminster Parliament, where the discussion now turns to the Labour Party and to Scotland.
Professor Richard Murphy, Keir Starmer's now ahead, in one opinion poll at least, for the first time since the election. Will that sort of quieten any sort of doubts among the Labour Party about his quiet, softly style?
I doubt it. The Labour Party is an odd beast and it's made up of many parts. But the real question, which I'm hearing from people who I'm talking to, and I make sure I do, is why are we only ahead in one opinion poll? At this stage, given the disasters that are going on inside the Conservative Party, given what has happened in the economy, what is going to happen with regard to jobs, what is happening with regard to coronavirus, surely they should be ahead by a massive margin. That's what parties have to do if they're going to win power. And it's taken Labour a long time to get close to being even nearly ahead. Now, you can say they pulled back 25+% from where they were in April, and of course that's good news. But I'm not sure that just being ahead at this moment is good enough.
Now, Peter Oborne, you've been quite an admirer of Sir Keir Starmer's style of leadership thus far. Do you think it is enough? Do you think this softly, catchy monkey approach is enough?
We're living through the biggest national crisis since the 1930s. Now, in those circumstances, to have a man of Johnson's style of politics, jokey, fun, celebrity politics, I wonder whether he is, as we move into a very dark period in not just British history, but global history, whether that is the style of leader which people are going to want. Now, the question is in due course, what may replace him? We're going to see an interesting replacement probably in the United States, Trump for Biden. Will that lead a sort of great swaggering alpha male replaced by rather a dullard? No. Are we going to see something similar here? No, maybe the change will come from within the Conservative Party, but if matters are as grave as I believe they are now, I don't rule out, I'm not saying I know how it will happen, but I do not rule out the possibility of a coalition government and Prime Minister Starmer before the next general election is due.
Richard Murphy, Peter Oborne focusing there on the tanking economy. And one of the paradoxes of the current polls is as the economy hurtles towards this cliff edge as a result of the COVID lockdown, the impact on the world economy, the Chancellor of the Exchequer's political stock seems to be rising. So how do you explain that, the tanking economy, but a rising prospects for the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
I think the Chancellor's fortunes are at their absolute peak at the moment, to be honest, Alex, and they're going to be tanking pretty darn soon. He has failed dismally to replace the furlough scheme. The furlough scheme was inspired and it worked. It provided confidence when confidence was necessary, and the cost of whatever it was, 40-odd billion, was insignificant in comparison to the alternatives that might have arisen. So, of course, his stock rose. He won with the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, even though it now appears to have been disastrous with regard to the spread of coronavirus. But so far, that has not hit him. But wait until the end of October, when the new job replacement scheme replaces the furlough scheme. Wait until early 2021, when companies are beginning to have to pay their back taxes, which have not so far been paid, when they have to begin to pay their rents, which have not been paid, mortgage deferment holidays begin to end, and cash flow crises are going to emerge right across the economy. Wait until there are people literally by the million, and I do mean by the million, becoming unemployed, because that is inevitable now. And most people are seriously underestimating how many million that is. I think we are talking at least 5 million unemployed. I cannot see otherwise with this new job retention scheme, because it is effectively an unemployment creation scheme. It has a perverse incentive within it to encourage employers to make people redundant, which could not be worse designed if you tried. And at that moment, is Rishi Sunak going to appear to be the guy who's going to save us all from problems? No, he's going to look like George Osborne did when George Osborne introduced a range of measures in budget after budget, which all went wrong, from the pasty tax to the caravan tax to all sorts of other things that time and again had to be reformed because he had made mistakes. And I believe he's going to look like a really troublesome chancellor who's failed to understand the scale of the problem he's facing. And austerity, which is his subtext, is the last thing that people in this country want.
So, Peter Oborne, is there an air of unreality about the severity of the economic outlook?
Very much so, I'm afraid, Alex. I'm reminded of I used to watch them a lot, the Looney Tunes Roadrunner cartoons. Do you remember when Roadrunner would be chasing or being chased and he hurtles over a cliff and his little legs keep him up up in the air for a little while. Then he looks down and sees, and then he goes whoosh all the way down to the bottom. And I'm afraid, what I greatly fear is we're now in a moment where those little legs are keeping him above. We're in the situation where our little legs are keeping us afloat, but we're going to have a big, big fall down the cliff soon.
So let's look lastly at the challenges from Scotland and from Ireland. Let's turn to Ireland first. The UK single market bill, the government seemed almost oblivious to the impact of that and the delicate balance of Northern Irish politics. How do we explain that, Richard Murphy? How do we explain that there was so little discussion about blithely saying we're going to breach international law, but only in certain respects, in terms of its impact on this balancing act of Ulster politics?
I think it's staggering ignorance is the only thing that one can use to explain this. The fact is that we've seen it that Tory ministers didn't know some very basic things. We had a Northern Ireland secretary who didn't know that Catholics voted for nationalist parties and Protestants voted for unionist parties. And she admitted as such in public. So I have to say, it seems to me that we're talking about an issue of pure outright ignorance and indifference to the consequences for Northern Ireland amongst the Conservative Party. And that shocks me, still does shock me.
Peter Oborne, has the government achieved the remarkable result of uniting unionism and nationalism in Northern Ireland in distrust of the Westminster government?
One thing I would add to Richard Murphy's excellent analysis back then is that the Times newspaper had 10 days or so ago, Francis Elliott, the political editor, very important analysis of the predicament facing Mr. Johnson, including a revelation, which I hadn't seen before, about how Brandon Lewis, the Northern Irish secretary, came to make this statement that he was ready to break international law. According to Francis Elliott and the Times, it was actually drafted for him by a junior special advisor reporting to Dominic Cummings inside Downing Street. And so it was set for him really by, and for Johnson, it just doesn't seem to really know much about it. On a matter of such importance, where you have a cabinet minister setting out a policy of breaking international law, to have been set for him by a special advisor and not complaining about it, by the way, just doing submissively what he's told by Dominic Cummings's representative, it does tell you something horrible, actually. I think horrible is the right word about the way this government is progressing at the moment.
Well, the moral of the story is perhaps read your briefs at all time. But let's turn lastly to Scotland. And how are this terrible trio at the head of the Conservative Party, Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove, the Prime Minister himself, how are they going to deal with the pesky Scots, Richard Murphy? How are they going to deal with this resurgent Scottish nationalism, support for independence we're seeing in the polls, when they assumed that coronavirus would help see it off?
I don't think they are going to deal with it. I think they're just going to think they can weather it out. They believe that it is their right to refuse a Section 30 referendum. They have to grant the right to that referendum, and they believe they can refuse to grant their right to that referendum by using this power given to them, and therefore they're not going to give it, and they believe that is sufficient. I simply think they're wrong. And the May 2021 elections in Scotland for Holyrood are going to be absolutely pivotal, because I don't see the Tories doing well in those elections. They have a confused leadership, and I do see the SNP doing well, and I can see other nationalist parties doing well, and therefore a nationalist majority is inevitable. What does that lead to? Inevitably to a call for a referendum and a straightforward confrontation, which is going to be very difficult to manage.
Peter Oborne, you're heart and soul a unionist. But do you think this unionist government, this Conservative and unionist government, really understands the concept of four nations within this union?
That it is still the case, I believe, that our four nations, however ardently Mr. Johnson is setting about trying to disprove this, are better off together.
And finally, to both of you, if I had to ask you to put your finger on one thing that's going to dictate the future of UK politics, would it be the economy stupid, or is there other aspects that we should be looking for over the next few months as dominating the political landscape? You first, Richard Murphy.
Students in rebellion is going to be something that's going to happen this term. They are so unhappy. We are going to see the rise of youth political awareness again. Come January, there's a very real chance we're going to see food shortages, and people who can't feed their children are very angry. Expect there to be mothers out on the streets, literally, who can't feed their children. And I honestly see that is going to happen. How else can we manage Brexit if we have queues of 7,000 lorries? And third, unemployed people have nothing to lose. And when people have nothing to lose and they can see their houses, whether they own them, whether they rent them, disappearing from underneath them, are going to be demanding change. The recipe at the moment for change is literally, well, put those three into a cauldron, turn it up to high and see what happens. And that's what's going to be the future for us over the next 9 months.
And Peter Oborne, that's an almost apocalyptic outlook from Richard Murphy. Do you see the problems and the rising tensions as seriously as he does?
But if there is an economic catastrophe, then I think we are going to live through a very, very difficult and challenging time.
Difficult, challenging times, but of course plenty of opportunities for copy for political commentators like the two experts on the left and the right of British politics that we've seen today. Peter Oborne, Professor Richard Murphy, thank you very much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Huge pleasure, Alex.
Thank you.
For a minority government such as Theresa May's, to lose parliamentary votes is unfortunate. But for a majority government to be on the run from its own backbenchers, well, that's downright careless. The Brexiteer troika at the heart of the Tory government, Johnson, Gove and Cummings, totally triumphant only a year ago, now look desperate and inept as the hard realities of COVID and Brexit are stubbornly to be brought into line with their own prejudices. Taking on the civil service, the courts or the BBC will be the least of their challenges if they cannot control even their own MPs. They face storms from within and without. Even as the economy tanks, the stock of the Chancellor rises and the Labour Party looks just about electable, while the Scots and Irish are looking restive about the present circumstances of London rule. All of which spells problems for the UK body politic, but will provide endless streams of socially distant copy for our expert commentators, as the Westminster ship heads towards some dark, indefinite shore. And so from Alex, myself and the whole team here, goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.